This tape should be tape number 5, and I'm going to tell my last real estate story on this tape. Sometime before we joined Century 21, an attorney approached our office and asked if we would list a piece of property that he had in an estate that he was trying to settle. He gave us only the legal descriptions of the property, and there were several, and he didn't, of course, know where the property was, other than he knew it was White Bear someplace. And we really didn't know where it was either until we got the plat book out and studied and found out just where it was located. The property was described by what they call leaps and bounds. You start at one point and it's so many feet to another point and so on and so forth, so many feet to another tree, and it goes on and on and on. And the price that he agreed to list it with us was $5,000. Well, I had no idea if it had any value at all, but Jim Langer, who was working with me at the time, and I went over to the possible location where the property would be according to the plat books. And we found a little alley or driveway that went south off of South Shore Boulevard. And we went up that driveway and walked, mostly because it was all covered with trees and so forth. And we determined just about where these parcels were. There was actually 2 different pieces, but they were not connected, but they were close to each other. And there was another legal description that looked like it might pertain to property on White Bear Lake. Well, it was landlocked, so there was no way we could give a good description in an ad, and we couldn't even put up a sign because we'd have to be putting the sign on private property. Didn't really know quite what to do with it. But a good friend of mine by the name of Elliot Olin, who worked for the Bacchus Construction Company, had told me that if I ever found a piece of property that needed developing and that he might be interested in, it wasn't too big, to let him know. So I called Elliot, and we went over and took the plat book again and tried to figure out where all this property was. And he was quite good at looking and reading these legal descriptions. And so we finally figured out just about where these 2 properties were. It was real woodsy and kind of wild. It was kind of pretty, and then, as I said before, it looked like there was a piece that went with it that was down on the lake shore. Well, a few days went by, and he called me up and said, tell you what, if you go in with me, I'll buy it, and we'll see if I can get the county or the township to put some roads through there, and then we can get the property developed. It looked like we might get as many as 6 lots, I believe it was, out of the parcels. So I agreed to go in with him, and we bought the property, and he went to work on it with the township. Well, it took them a long time because it's very complicated. And they got people from the township to go out and see what the potential was, not only for our property, but for a lot of landlocked property that was in the same area. And after a period of about 3 or 4 years, he got them to put in some roads so that we got 2 lots on one side of one road and 4 lots along another road. In fact, we even had to sell them part of our property in order to make the road. It took the township about a year to put in the roads with sewer, and water, and underground electric and telephone lines. And in the meantime, we had drawn some plats to divide this property into the 6 lots. We got the plats approved by the at the courthouse and recorded at the courthouse. They had the lots surveyed and had stakes put out. And then he chose one of the lots that he would want to build on in the future, and I chose one next to it. And long before they finished the road, Charlotte and I had designed a house that we thought we would like, and had a contractor, in fact it was a Bacchus company, start building our house. It was rather interesting because they were working on the road at the same time that they were building the house, and of course there were a lot of complications, and it took us about 6 months to get the house built. That, of course, had a story in itself, but we won't go into that. It did take a lot of pictures, and we were real interested in it because I would have to go there periodically. In fact, I went every day to see that the kids that played in that woods wouldn't take the house apart before it got built. And they did do some damage, but what I did was to hire some of the kids that I found in the woods and offered them like 50 cents or $1 a piece to watch the house so some of the other kids wouldn't damage it, and it worked out quite well. The house was quite large. It was what they call a walkout rambler. So it was exposed on the lower level. One whole side was exposed, and then a portion of the other side. And the front was level with the street. In the basement, we finished off 2 bedrooms and bath, and it had and a family room, and then it had a room that we made into our pool table room, and of course then there was a furnace room. On the main level there were again 2 bedrooms and bath, and another large family room, and a living room, and then a big kitchen with a dining area, lots of cabinets. It had a washer and dryer and a sink at one side of the room, which was could be closed off with bifold doors, and then that kitchen opened up into went out to a porch, a big porch, and then in front of that was the big 2-car garage. It was a pretty nice house. We lived there for something like 17 or 18 years before we finally moved to Florida. Denny had moved over with us, and so had Kathy at first, and then, of course, we had Tom. Now, Tom particularly enjoyed it. It was an adjustment for him to move away from his friends, but he particularly enjoyed it, and we, of course, had this lake shore. We put up a dock and had a boat and so forth, and he enjoyed that too. But he especially liked the wildlife, and he would have many places in the backyard where he would put out bird seed that I bought for him, and he had the squirrels coming in, the chipmunks, and he had rabbits, and he had all sorts of birds. It was really pretty because there was quite a large portion of the property that was still woods, and then behind us there was some property that was undeveloped, and that was all woods, and then there was a little pond just a few hundred feet from the house where the ducks would come in, and it was really beautiful spot, and we really enjoyed it. And then we had these lots to sell, and of course in those days lots didn't sell for what they do today. And we sold two of the lots on one of the streets, and I think we got about $4,000 a piece for them. And then Elliot built his house next door to me, and we sold another lot for, I believe it was around $5,000, and then we still had one left, which some years later we sold for about $9,000. Now I mention these figures because in today's market, those lots would be anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 each. But we were going according to the market at that time. We lived at this house at 2661 Arbor Drive for about 18 years. During that time, of course, Denny had joined the Navy and participated in the war in Vietnam. He had come home and then later lived in various different houses and apartments and had various different jobs. At one time he came back and lived with us for a year or two. He brought his dog Ruby, which Mother liked very much. It was a nice dog, and we got along pretty good, but it was an outside dog, and of course in the winter it was pretty tough having the dog outside. And Kathy had Patrick, and she and Patrick had gone to Wichita to join Mike, because after he got sent back from overseas, he was stationed in Wichita. As I remember, they were there a couple of years, and one time Shar and Tom went to visit her and Pat, and they went by plane. Well, it so happened that the plane they were to leave on had a lot of trouble and didn't leave till late, and when it did get there, why it got to Kansas City, where they were going to transfer to Wichita, and they were too late to catch the plane to Wichita, so they got another plane, and that plane couldn't land in Wichita because of storms, and went on to Oklahoma City and landed there in a storm, and they had nothing but trouble from then on. The airline hired a bus to take them from Oklahoma City to Wichita, and then they got out on the highway in the storm. The bus went off the road and went into a ditch and almost tipped over. the driver had to order a tow truck to pull them out, and when they got out, they finally went on to Wichita, but their luggage had been underwater and was damaged, so were their clothes, and they were something like 12 hours late getting into Wichita. Then Char and I visited them once while they were down there. They had a good time over there, and both of them got jobs in a restaurant and a golf club, and they earned some extra money and learned an awful lot before they came back to White Bear and moved into their home on Homewood. In the meantime, of course, Tom was growing up. He had a regular menagerie in the backyard, besides the wild mallard ducks and wood ducks and ring-necked pheasants and mink and raccoons and all the various birds, of course, rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks. He kept pretty busy. We built a large pen out of chicken wire and had a little house, like a dog house, at one end of it, and we bought some ring-necked pheasants and some silver pheasants. Tom had those for quite a few years. In fact, even after he was married and gone, we still had the birds. But while we had them, it was quite an experience. It was very educational, and he had a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun with him too. On occasion, he would get the eggs from the hens and bring them in, and we'd incubate them. In fact, one time we bought some setting hens, chickens that would supposedly set on eggs, and we were able to raise several small pheasants, and some of course did grow up, some of them didn't make it, but it was a great experience for him. And then one time he came running in, he saw a big turtle digging a hole to put her eggs in, and sure enough, we went out and watched, and it was very educational to see how they dig their hole and drop their eggs in and cover it up and go to the lake and never come back. And the baby turtles are on their own. They underground for a period of time, which I can't remember right now. We watched and kept track on the calendar, and finally we got the little turtles out, and he had them in a tub for some period of time, and then took them down to the lake. We even had deer at a later date. Deer would come through the yard, and they were very, very beautiful. But they shouldn't really been there because they were in an area where there was a lot of traffic, and some of the deer were killed later on the streets. The thing about this was that we were right in the middle of a residential area, and yet very wooded, partially because Tom did so much feeding of the birds and animals, and partially because of this little pond that we had there, we did get a lot of wildlife. In 1977 or 78, Mother Axelson came to live with us. This was Char's mother, Mabel Axelson. She was about 82 at that time. She'd lived alone since her husband had died many years before and had got along very well. However, her eyesight had failed considerably, and she really needed someone to look after her. And we had plenty of room, and I told her that any time she wanted to, she could come and live with us. So one day she said that's what she'd like to do, so we brought her over to our house, and she sold our little house to our grandson, Ricky. Mother had a bedroom downstairs. She had her own bath. The family room was made into kind of a living room for her. I did some work in the furnace room, panel walls and so forth, and put a kitchen table in there and a hot plate, and there was a sink in there, and she used that for a little kitchen, and she got along very well. She ate with us the big meals and fixed her own breakfasts and sometimes her own lunch. And she was very able at the time. It was just that her eyesight wasn't too good. Bob and Cheryl used to pick her up just about every Sunday and take her to church, and then take her out for dinner, and then they'd bring her home late in the afternoon. One of the things that she enjoyed the most was these ducks and animals in the backyard. We had a large swing that she would sit on and watch for the birds and animals. And usually she would doze off, but it was really good for her to be outside, and she enjoyed that. And she liked to have me buy corn, and I'd get, I think there were 50-pound bags of corn at a time, and then she would feed the ducks and, of course, squirrels and so forth. And that was a thing that she really enjoyed doing, and the ducks and the squirrels and chipmunks and that would come right up to her, walk on her shoes even, and she would feed them, and she did that for all the years that she lived with us at that house in the summertime. However, one winter, for whatever reason, some ducks started to come in. They were mallard ducks, and they had come from a preserve that the county had some miles away where there was open water, and they fed them at that spot. But some of them apparently knew about Ma, and so they came over to visit her, and she saw them, and she would go out in the backyard and sweep or shovel a big spot for them to land on, and then she would put out a pail of corn, and it was really a sight to see. We'd have as many as 100 ducks would come in almost all at one time and land in this opening where she would have the corn. And if she would go out there with them, they would just crowd around her and walk all over her feet and eat out of her hand, and we could watch it from the upstairs window, and there was nothing that was more exciting than to see her out there with her ducks. But they made such a mess in the yard that the following spring I had to actually chop up the grass where they had done their duty, and I didn't particularly care to have them anymore. And they didn't come back, I don't think, any winters after that. But she thoroughly enjoyed that backyard. And on occasion, deer would even come through while she was sitting there. She couldn't see them too good, but They go right on practically within 10 or 15 feet of her. We had been going to our little house on Maple Avenue in Fort Myers in the winter time, sometimes for a couple of weeks, sometimes for several weeks. And when Mother moved over with us, why, we would take her along. Of course, we used to fly in those days. And there are a few little stories I'd like to tell about that. However, what I was going to mention was not too long after she'd moved over with us, a few years maybe, one day I heard her hollering downstairs and went down, and she was on the floor, and what had happened is she had been on the telephone and forgot that she had her vacuum cleaner out, and she turned around, she tripped over the wire and fell, and she broke her hip. Well, that was quite an ordeal. She was in the hospital for a while, and it was a bad break. They had to insert a ball in which has a little metal flange on it that goes into the leg. And it was a bad operation, but she pretty tough and strong, and she got through that okay. And then we brought her home, and we had her downstairs, but she had to learn to walk again, and little by little we had a nurse come, a therapist come and work with her, and finally got her so that she'd work her way up the stairs on her seat, and take one at a step at a time, and she could come up and was able to eat with us. And this went on for a few months, and then finally we took her that winter to Florida with us, and there again she and I spent a lot of time trying to get her to walk and learn how to go up and down steps, and it worked out quite well, and she finally got so she could walk again quite good. One of the times that we took her down to Florida was quite exciting. We were to take a charter plane out of Minneapolis on a direct flight to Fort Myers. When we got to the airport, we waited a long time and finally found out that there was a problem with a plane. Kind of funny, all the years that we flew, we had several little incidents, but none of them fatal, thank goodness. But this particular time, they had to do a lot of work to the plane, and so we were going to be quite late. Our neighbor down here in Fort Myers, Jim Lacey, had offered to pick us up at the airport, and they had built a new airport at that time. It was only a couple of years old, and he was going to meet us there. Well, we would have got in sometime in the afternoon, but now that the plane had a problem, it was going to be quite late, so I called him and told him that the plane was going to be late and that we'd take a cab, and he shouldn't bother coming. And he said, well, I got headlights, I can drive at night, and I'll be there. He wouldn't have it any other way. So finally we took off, and we had a good flight, but because Mother was partially crippled, we had got her on first, and she was sitting we were sitting in the first seat in the one side of the plane. And before we left, the stewardess had offered a lot of free drinks and so forth because of the delay in the flight. But anyhow, we had a good flight going down. We got close to Fort Myers, and the captain came on and said that we were getting close to Fort Myers and that we should put on our seat belts and so forth, and the stewardesses should take their seats, which they did, and there was 3 of them sitting directly across from us, all strapped in. And of course, now you remember, we're right up in the front of the plane near the cockpit. And the plane went down. It came down for a landing, and when we hit the deck, there's no way I could explain to you how fast we stopped. It seemed like it was only a few hundred feet. Even the stewardesses looked rather shocked, and said we stopped quite soon, and pretty soon the captain came on the loudspeaker and he said, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that we're in Fort Myers, and the bad news is that we're at the wrong airport. Well, of course, everybody went, oh, you know. And Shar and I had flown many times during the past years, and flown into the old airport, which was now basically closed to large planes. There was only a runway for small planes and some cargo planes and that sort of thing, but there were no passenger planes that landed there. They all landed at the new airport, which was 15, 20 miles away. Well, we didn't know it at the time, but we found out rather soon. The weather was really bad. Not only was the weather bad, it was real foggy, but the pilot had been notified that there was another plane on the runway that they were having a problem with. So they had told him that if he'd like to, he'd probably be better to go back to Tampa. Well, a couple things, I suppose, ran through his mind. First place, this was just a charter plane, and it was not one of the regular airlines, so they wouldn't have any facilities in Tampa for him to put up the people. And secondly, he apparently saw some lights, landing lights, through the fog, and thought, well, I might as well land because I can see the landing lights. So he came down, and I suppose when he got almost to the deck, he realized that he was in the wrong place, and so when he landed, he didn't know where he was going. It was all fog, and there wasn't much in the line of lights, so he had to brake the brakes as fast as he could, and luckily for us, he was able to stop the plane very suddenly. He came out and he said to the stewardess, give them all free drinks and keep them entertained, and I'll be back in a little while. Well, of course, Shar and I knew where we landed because we were familiar with this airport, and we opened the door, the big door, which was right alongside the mother practically, and we could see down. Of course, there's no steps or ladder or anything because there's nobody there, and we could see through the fog down to the ground. Well, the captain went out the back of the plane. There's stairs going out the back, and he went out the back, and the stewardess said, well, can't give them any free drinks because we gave them all free drinks before we left. In fact, we ran out of water even. Well, the captain was gone for about an hour and a half, and when he came back, he had walked clear to the other end of the airport. At the end of the airport that we were at was completely closed. The tower was closed. Everything was closed. It had been closed for several years. But when he got to the other end of the airport where the small the hangars for the small planes were, there were fire engines there, and he came back with 2 fire engines and a pickup truck. So then they backed up the pickup truck to the plane, and the stewardesses and the pilots unloaded all the luggage, and they used the fire engine's lights to light up the plane. And now, of course, we're in the front of the plane, so we have to go out the back where the last one's out. And there was, as I said, no one there other than these fire engines and this pickup truck that the captain brought. But he had ordered some buses, and the buses were to come into the terminal at the end where we were. But of course that was all locked up, so they had to get guards to unlock all the gates, and the terminal building had been closed and boarded up for several years. But when we finally got all our gear together, and Ma was, of course, walking with a cane, and Shar walked her all the way around through this gate and over by the terminal building, and when we got there, here were 2 buses and a pickup, and I should say a station wagon. And the station wagon was Jim Lacey. He had heard on the loudspeaker at the international airport that we had landed at Page Field, and that the buses would bring us all over to that airport. But he drove over and waited for the guards to open the gate, and we got there before the buses did. So he picked us up and took us to our house in Fort Myers, but no one got hurt, and we were very fortunate because when we got out to look where we were at, the plane was somewhere about 100 feet from a fence which was in front of the tower. Had we gone, say, another 100 feet, we would have gone through the fence and hit the tower. And of course, what could have happened then. So we were very fortunate, and that was one of the big experiences we had taking Ma to Fort Myers. I hope that I haven't made it sound like all we did was work and had a lot of hardships and tough times during our lifetime, because we had a lot of good times too, and we did a lot of traveling. We went to Phoenix area. One year we took Tom and Kathy and put them in school down there, and then he stayed with Grandma back in White Bear, and we stayed 3 months. During the time we were there, my dad, Kruger, and his friend Genevieve, who was a great friend of ours and had been a good friend of my mother's, they came down to Phoenix and got an apartment and stayed there for a few months also. And while they were there, Denny went and stayed with Bob and Cheryl, and Mother Axelson came down and stayed with us for a few weeks. And that was exciting, a lot of fun to have a family down there. One quick story about Mother. She hadn't flown before, and she was kind of apprehensive and worried and a little afraid. And about that time, she must have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 or so. And so we were all concerned about her. And Bob and Cheryl put her on the plane in Minneapolis, and then we met her when she got off the plane in Phoenix. Of course, as I said, we were all very concerned about her. So when she got off the plane, we said, she looked real good, and we said, were you afraid on the plane, Mother? And, well, no, she said, I didn't have time. She says there was a little old lady sitting next to me that was afraid, and so I held her hand and talked to her all the way down, and I didn't have time to get afraid. So that was typical of Mother. She always looking after someone else. Well, we had, as I say, a very good time while we were there. Kathy and Tom were both in school, and we went on a lot of picnics and trips and so forth, especially with my dad and Genevieve, and with Mother too also. But along towards the end, my dad had started to be bothered with heart attacks again, and he ended up in the hospital. He was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and it was getting towards the time when we were to return back to Minnesota, and we couldn't really leave him there, and he couldn't drive his car, and he was in pretty bad shape. So he and Jen flew back to Minnesota, and they hired someone to drive his car back. And then a few days later, Shar and Tom and Kathy and I drove back to Minnesota. Now, he was all right for a little while after he got back, but one day I got a call from his tenant downstairs, and he had heard Dad fall on the floor upstairs, and had called the ambulance, and they had taken him to the hospital. Well, we hurried to the hospital, but didn't get there quite on time, and he had passed away. That was on May 10th, 1963. We had previously had lots of fun with Jen and my dad. We'd gone on a lot of picnics. We'd gone fishing. We'd gone up north on trips. We'd gone to Duluth. We've done many, many things together. They used to come out almost every Saturday evening and play cards. And Kathy and Denny got to know him very well, and of course Tom got to know him too, but not to the extent that Kathy and Denny did. And he loved those kids, I'll tell you that, and so did Jen, and they spent a lot of time with them and did a lot of things for them, and of course we all missed Dad when he was gone. But he'd led a good life, and we would never have wished him back, of course. Getting back to some of our vacations, Shar and I went on many vacations, some of them with the kids and some without. She and I went to Chicago early on when Shirley took care of both Denny and Kathy, and we were there for about a week and enjoyed that. We went to, as I stated, Phoenix several times, and then we used to go to Las Vegas in later years, and I would say we probably went to Las Vegas at least 15, 16, 18 times, a couple times on conventions, but usually just the two of us, and we really had a good time. We'd always stay for 3 or 4 days and had a lot of fun. We also went to Mexico several times. When my dad was down there with us at Phoenix, we'd gone down into Mexico a few times. And then later, Shar and I went by ourselves. We flew down to Acapulco and stayed for a week or so on one occasion. Another time we went to Mexico City, flew there, and then took a bus over again to Acapulco.